Welcome to the ultimate HTTP module in Make course, your step-by-step guide to mastering the HTTP module. I'm Denis Panyuta, and in the next 1.5 hours, I'll take you from the basics to advanced techniques using real-world examples, hands-on demos, and clear explanations. Whether you're here to learn to build efficient HTTP modules in Make.com or want to dive deeper into the ins and outs of them, this course is designed to give you practical tools and the confidence to innovate your projects. I'll break down complex topics into easy-to-follow segments, peppered with real-life examples and plenty of tips you can use right away. Here's what you can expect. You will learn how webhooks work in depth, what JSON is, what the APIs are, what an API is, how to make a request with the HTTP module in Make, what response codes are, and even how to do OAuth to HTTP requests, which are a little more tricky, but we're going to dive deeper into it. By the end of this course, you'll not only have the skills to create your own powerful applications, but also fully understand what is happening under the hood. So let's dive in and let's get started on your journey to becoming a Make automation pro. If you look at this automation here, or this scenario that I have here, I have a bunch of HTTP modules for different levels of the scenario. So you're going to have to learn multiple different things in order to fully understand how the HTTP module works. For example, you need to understand JSON. You need to understand what an API is. You need to understand how to make an HTTP request, as well as how to make an authenticated request, because sometimes you need to authenticate your request. And then we also need to look at response codes, because an HTTP module can deliver multiple different types of responses. Okay, and we're going to do that each in a separate video. So we're starting with the first one here, which is a webhook. Why am I using this webhook? Well, I'm using a webhook because I just love webhooks, and I think they are the best tool or the best module inside of Make.com, because they allow you to make sure that you only run your automation when there's actually something to do. So when something triggers that automation, and it doesn't just wait for a given moment in time to happen. So here, for example, obviously in Make.com, you can run an automation every minute, every 15 minutes, every hour, and so forth. But I want things to happen instantly. So the moment somebody, for example, entered data into a form, I want the information from that form to be transferred to me and run my automation based on it directly. So in order to achieve that, we need to understand webhooks. So therefore, let's go ahead and run our first webhook and understand how it works. Therefore, I'm gonna create a new scenario here. And here, I'm just going to select webhooks here. If you don't find it there, you can just enter webhooks here, and then it will show you the different options of webhooks there are. So there are triggers as well as actions. So the one that I want to specifically look at is going to be this webhook here. So this custom webhook instance. All right, this is the one. The cool thing is it triggers instantly when the webhook receives data. Okay, so let's select that. You also will see that you get this little lightning signal or symbol here on the left hand side, surrounded by the circle. And then you can create a webhook that will be specific for this Make scenario or this automation. So I'm going to call this one webhook tutorial, like so. I'm going to call it like this. You can call it whatever you want. And then once you gave it a name, you can copy the address to clipboard and you can click on OK. So now I copied it to clipboard. That's important because what I want to show you is how to trigger this webhook. So now if I run this, it will wait for the data. So it will say here at the bottom left, waiting for data. So this webhook now is ready to be triggered. How can I trigger the webhook? Well, I can just go over to a new tab and I can paste the webhook URL that I got from creating this webhook. So I entered this URL in there. I'm going to press enter. And then what it will do is it will just say accepted. Okay, there we are. We get the details about accepted, and our automation also ran. So you can see that here it says that there was an output after this operation or of this operation. So you can click into this one up here and then it will show you the output. Now currently the output was empty because this webhook didn't receive any information. It was triggered, however, there was no data transmitted. How can we transmit data with a given webhook? Well, therefore, we can do the following. Let me show you how that works. We can take the URL that we got. So let's click into this one here, into this webhook, and let's make sure that we copy this URL, right? It's this entire URL. Now, obviously you can copy it like this, or you can just click on this button, copy address to clipboard. Okay, once you copied that, you can paste it into your URL tab here, or as a URL in here, and then you can add a question mark. And after that, you enter a variable name. Okay, let's say the variable name is going to be name. And I'm going to say name is equal to Dennis. Okay, I'm going to write it like this because that's my name equal Dennis. So let's run this automation once again. So we're going to say run once, and then let's press enter here. And our automation ran. It went very quickly this time, you see. And it says the output bundle was name : Dennis. So data was actually converted or used and now is available. All right. Now you can go ahead and use any further automation in here. So you could just say, let's say you want to do something with ChatGPT. So you create a completion. You use your ChatGPT connection. If you don't know how to do that, check out my other videos. And then you just select any given model. So let's say I'm going to select the latest 4.0 model that I want to use. Well, there was an error. Let me just enter it again or click on OK and look into it again. And you will see that now it should work. And then we can go into using that variable that our webhook just got as the output. So the name, okay? So we can add this message. We can say it's a user message. And I'm gonna say that the text content should be, so the prompt that I give to ChatGPT, so to speak, is come up with childish jokes about this name, because you might have had this experience as a kid in school. Maybe you had a stupid name or last name, well, not stupid, but a last name that could be played around with and made stupid jokes about. And well, that's what happens to me. Dennis, if you pronounce it in German, you can come up with very stupid names. Oh, well, things around it. So I'm going to just use the name that was given through the webhook, and I'm going to run this once again. I'm going to enter the name again, and then it will trigger this automation, and it will do this OpenAI ChatGPT automation as well. So you see there is a little more data. So the input that we gave was come up with childish jokes about this name, Dennis. Okay, and the output, the result, so to speak, is here, sure thing, here are some lighthearted childish jokes about name Dennis. Why did Dennis bring a ladder to school? Because he heard the math test was over his head. Well, I probably don't understand many of the jokes. I was thinking about more of like jokes specifically about the name Dennis and not so much about generic jokes, but then is the best day ever. Yeah, so you see, it's not very funny, but for example, my last name is Panuta, and we have the sweet in German, which is called Hanuta, and many kids were making a joke about that as well. So Panuta Hanuta, and I love Hanutas actually. Really tasty sweets. So now you got the idea how to use webhooks with data. Now there's one last thing to know, and that is what if you want to give more information. So not just one word, you could obviously have a bunch of other details. So what to do with so and so. Now the problem is empty spaces aren't really treated very well, but actually let's just try and see what's gonna happen. So I'm gonna pass this like so, and you see the name was given what to do with so and so. So that seemed to work, and it's tried to make some jokes about it as well. Usually you see once I entered this URL, an empty space is converted into %20. Okay, so that's the internal, the URL name for an empty space, so to speak. Okay, so let me show you how to use multiple variables. So you had the name, let's say Dennis, and then let's say you want to also store the age somewhere, and let's say I'm 36. So you use this ampersand sign, and then the second variable name, and then equals, and then whatever the value for that variable should be. Okay, so age should be 36, for example. Okay, so now let's say we run this again here. So run this automation, we enter this, and we will see that now it's not just the first variable, but it's also the second variable. So now we could, in this import here, in this OpenAI module or any other module that we're using, we could use both variables. Okay, so now let's look into it. And here you see, now we can use name as well as age. So in our particular case, we manually created these variables inside of the URL, right? But that's usually not what you would do. Usually you would use a tool that gives you this information, gives you certain variables. For example, Airtable is the one that I love to use in order to run webhooks where, for example, the form is entered and all of the fields that were entered can be passed to the webhook so that it can then be used directly inside of my automation, just as an example. Let's look at what JSON is and how it works. Therefore, I have this very short presentation here. So what is JSON? JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is a lightweight data interchange format. So what is a lightweight data interchange format? Well, it's basically a format that allows you to interchange data, which means that allows you to transfer data from one software solution to another, or from one server to another. So basically, when you are working with different modules and you want to transfer a lot of data and you want to transfer it with an HTTP request, for example, you need to bring it into the right format. And the format is going to be JSON. Why is JSON such a good format? Well, because it is a structured key value pair format with arrays and nested objects and all the good stuff, but basically just allows us to convert data that is stored, let's say, in a database into a format that is readable for humans, but also very efficiently readable by computers. So that's really the main point here. So let's look at what this JSON looks like. So here we have a JSON object, and this JSON object contains a bunch of information. So it contains the age, it contains the name, the skills, and the address. All three of them, or there are three different things that are happening in here. So we have the key value pair, which you can see here. So the key is always a string. That's the left part here. For example, age, name, skills is always a string. What is a string? A string is text. So when you are using strings or text inside of JSON, you need to surround it by quotations. All right. And then you have the values, and the values, they can be strings, numbers, arrays, booleans, or other objects. And what strings and numbers are, you will know now. Arrays are basically just collections of data. Booleans are values that can be true or false, and other objects can be another, for example, JSON object, or an object that is a little more complex. We're going to look at that in this video. So here in this case, we have an object with four pairs of keys and values. So we have this age, which is 25. We have the name, which is Dennis. So we have a key value pair age 25, where age is the key, 25 is the value, and both of them are strings. So this 25, for example, is stored as a string because it's surrounded by quotations. And if it weren't surrounded by quotations, then it would be considered a number. All right. And this technically makes a difference in coding, but for our purposes, we're just going to work with strings because it makes it easier to store data in a database, for example, inside of your tables, inside of, let's say, a Google Sheets document, Excel, and so forth. So let's look at this in a little more easier to read way, okay? So let's go over to our module here, and I ran it real quick. Okay, so I ran a webhook, which I connected with this tool called Airtable. You don't have to do that. I'm going to show you how to create a webhook that will give you this depth of information. So it will be a quite a long webhook, but you can achieve that without having to subscribe to a tool such as Airtable in order to make this run. So what we have here is we have this module that is a JSON module. It says create JSON, and we're going to build this out in a bit as well. But before we do that, let's see what the execution of this JSON module does for us. So it creates, or it takes the output from this webhook here, and it creates this JSON string. So it creates a string of type JSON. All right. So the string contains this information. Let's just copy this information, and let's go to a website that makes strings or JSON a little more readable. So this, for example, here, jsonformatter.curiousconcepts.com allows you to make this a little more difficult string of JSON data more readable. So I'm gonna paste it in here, click on process, and then it makes this beautiful formatted JSON data for me. So it created this more readable format that I can now work with. So what is in here? What can I see? I can see that the age is 25, the name is Dennis. So these are simple, but what is going on here? Well, here we have this thing called skills and we have a plural. So skills can be multiple things. So if you want to store multiple information within one key, for example, skills, then you need to use something called an array. An array can have multiple pieces of information. In this case, it has the automation, it has the coding, and it has teaching. And each of those are strings because they are surrounded by quotations and they are separated by a comma. However, they start or they are surrounded by squared brackets. So if you see squared brackets in a JSON document or in a JSON file, you know that this is an array. And then we have the address here. So the address, this is again surrounded by curly brackets. So it's surrounding it not by squared brackets as we saw here, because otherwise we could think it's an array. Well, this is not an array. This is an object itself. An object can have multiple properties, so to speak. So an address consists of multiple properties. For example, the zip, the city. Now you could obviously go ahead and make it more complex where you also add let's say the street, for example, a street name, the number, the person's name, or the addressant name or so, right? But let's just keep it simple where we just have the zip and the city. So this is the format that we have for our JSON file that is based on this database entry. So I'm taking the age, I'm taking the skills, and I'm taking the address. And all of these pieces of information, also the name, all of these pieces of information are transferred via this webhook. So this webhook has all of these relevant details. And now what we did is we converted it into JSON. So in order to create JSON out of it, we need to create something called a data structure. Okay, so let's go ahead and build this out from scratch. Therefore, I go back to the scenario that we built in the last video where we looked at what webhooks are and how they work. So I'm going to get rid of this OpenAI module and I'm going to search for JSON here, and there you will find this create JSON module. All right, so now it says create JSON and it asks me for a data structure. Now, obviously I can select data structures that were there already, or I can create one myself. So I'm going to call this one Webhooks tutorial data structure, or you could call it, let's say, HTTP tutorial data structure. Maybe that's better. And then I need to give it a specification. So here the specification is the items that I want to create a JSON out of. For example, I want to give it the name of the first item in my JSON object, and that was the age. So I can store the age as a text, as we have done here. So you see, we store it as text, it's surrounded by quotations. Otherwise, you could make it a number, but then, for example, let's say you get the data from your database, and here the age is actually stored as a number. So here you see it is stored as a number, but it can also just be very easily converted into text by make. So you could keep it as number, or you can use it as text. Using it as text makes a few things later on easier, but that's something that would go beyond the scope of this video. So the default can be empty, but you can also set a default. So let's say you don't get any value from your webhook, you could set the age to, let's say, 0, for example, or to be more precise, quotation, 0 quotation. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it as default. Then we're not going to say it's required. And because if it's required and the data isn't passed, then it would cause an error. Now, obviously, sometimes you want that because you need the data maybe later on, but sometimes you don't need it. Okay, then we have multi-line, which I'm going to set to no. And now I'm going to add more items. So by the way, multi-line is if you have multiple pieces of data that is stored or given over multiple lines. So if it's a lot of data, then yes would be an option. But usually for a name or so, it's not necessary. So here we stored the age. Now let's store the name. And I'm going to use name as the name of this second property. Okay, so coming back to our JSON format, this is the second property. Now, looking at how I called it in my other example, I'm going to capitalize age as well as name, at least the first letter. So this will be also of type text. Then I'm going to add another item, and the other item would be skills. Okay, so skills now we saw is of type array. So let's go ahead and use array here. So I'm going to say skills, and the type should be array. Now, once I select array, I need to define what the type of every single item in the array is going to be. And every single item is also going to be a text. Okay, so I'm gonna add another item to make it even more complex, which is this time object. So the address you see was not an array. It didn't have squared brackets, but it had curly brackets. So the name will be address and the type will be where I will have to set it to a collection. So I need to store it as a collection and I need to define what the specifications are. So for example, one item is zip. So I'll need to set that to zip and it's just going to be text. And another item was my city. Okay, so I'm going to set that to city. All right. So once I saved that data structure, you will find that this is what our JSON creator, this create JSON module, is expecting. It's expecting an age, a name, skills, zip, and city. And all of them are obligatory. So all of them are optional. I never set any of them to be required. Okay. So here, if you want to modify this data structure, you can click into these little dotted lines here and click on edit and you can modify whatever you want. So for example, if you wanted to make the age mandatory, you could make it required in here. Okay. So now that we will create this JSON object, well, make doesn't like it when like this module is the last module in the loop. So I'm going to add a tools module where I'm just going to set a variable and the variable name will be name and the variable value will just be name. Okay, I'm just going to do that for now. I'm not going to go into that for for this point in the video. But now let's go ahead and make sure that we run our webhook again. So it was this URL here. Let's run this webhook again and see how the JSON object is created for us by this JSON module. Okay, so I'm going to say run once. I'm going to go over to my webhook. This was the URL for the webhook. And after that, I passed or entered the name as Dennis and the age as 36. Okay, so let me run this. And once I do, my automation should run through and you will see that none of the information was entered in here and it created an empty JSON string for me. So not empty, but with null information. So it just says null, null, null. Null is going to be used whenever you don't pass any details. So now what we can do is we can use the data from the webhook. So for example, I can assign age as the age that I get from the webhook, and I can assign name as the name. So now let's do that again. Let's run this code again with the same URL here, with the same webhook. And then the JSON will look a little different. So you see, we get the age, we get the name, but we don't get any skills and address yet. So how can we modify our URL to pass this information as well? Well, we need to add the ampersand sign, then skills equals, for example, I have skills in automation, in coding, and teaching. And I'm separating all of them with a comma. And then I want to store the address. So the address is a tricky one. So the address, if we look at it, consists of zip as well as city. So how can I pass the zip as well as the city with the address? Because this is not an array, right? This is an object or a collection. So in order to pass this, I need to say address.zip is going to be, let's say, equal 10,001. And then the address of the city, and here I need to use the and sign again. So address.city is going to be equals to New York. And you can pass an empty space here, but it's better if you use the %20 or %20. This is the equivalent of an empty space. So New York. I'm going to run this once my automation is ready. Okay, so I'm going to run this webhook, okay, or trigger the webhook. So now we will see that all of the information is passed. So zip is passed, city is passed, the skills are passed. So now I can modify my JSON object here to pass the zip, which will be this, and the city, which will be this, and the skills, which will be the skills. All right. And actually, let's see if this is going to do it. I don't think we will get the skills correctly, but let's try it. So let's run this again. And we see that we get the skills, well, did separate them, but actually it put all of them into one variable, well, one slot. Okay, so let's copy this and see how it looks like. inside of our JSON formatter. So let me run this and you will see what I mean. So here, the skills, they are not separated. So they're all one skill. Even though they should be multiple separated skills like you see here, they are now considered as one skill. So how can we make sure that the skills are stored like they were here? Well, we need to modify our webhook where we're going to say skills equals automation and skills equals coding and skills equals teaching. Okay, once we pass all of this information like that, let's run it once again. And we run our script and we should now see that we get it in the right format. Let me make sure that I run it again correctly. Running it, there we are. And yeah, I didn't modify this JSON, that's why. So here I need to say the skills should be like so, and add another item. So here I am assuming that I have 3 items. So I'm going to use item 0, I'm going to use item 1, and I'm going to use item 2 in here. So now if we run this again, we will see that now we get our skills as individual items. So I might have made a mistake in here with the first one where it says skills automation, but I think you get the point. So skills 0, it didn't seem to like. So let's use skills 1, 2, and 3. All right, so let's run it again. And now we have coding, automation, and teaching. So all 3. And now if we run this again through our JSON formatter with the updated file, you can see that the skills are stored as separate entities inside of our JSON file. So this is a little tinkering, but I hope it shows you how it technically works and how the different aspects of JSON strings work. So we have created a JSON object now. So the last thing that I want to show you is how you can parse JSON. So we've seen how to take data that we have gotten from a webhook, or in this case from a table. So I built this other automation with this database here, but you need to have a paid account in order to make it work properly because of the automation. So I'm not going to go into that in depth here, but how can I get it? Well, how can I do it the other way around? So how can I take a JSON object or a JSON file, so the JSON text, so to speak, and make it so that I can use the individual variables of it? Because if we look at our output here, we cannot do that. Let me show you how. So let me actually get rid of this set variable. And here I'm going to parse JSON. And what this does is it takes a JSON string, and out of that JSON string, it creates variables that we can then use as output for our work. So let me show you. I'm going to use the data structure that we used earlier. And as a JSON string, I'm going to use the one that we get as an output from here. So from 6, you can see that once you click in it, you see that it says 6.JSON string, which means it gets it from this particular module. So we take this JSON string output and parse it into objects. So let me again use this set variable here, where I'm going to say name is going to be name. This is really just to make sure that make doesn't complain that we are using a parsing of a JSON module as the last module inside of this scenario. So let's run this once again, and let's run it with our webhook that we created last time. And you will see that it takes the JSON string as an input and it creates all of these outputs for us. So the individual variables. So it gives me the age, the name, the skills as an array, the address as zip, and city as a collection. So now I can go ahead and here I can now use all of these details from parse JSON. I can use the age, the name, the skills, the address in the right format. So obviously we wouldn't need that because we get the data from this webhook, but sometimes you get the response as a JSON string, and sometimes you want to create a JSON string. So here we created the JSON string, and here we saw how we can take a JSON string and make usable objects or variables out of it so that we can use them throughout the rest of our automation. Okay, and next we're going to see what an API is, and then we will look at how we can make HTTP requests. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we're going to, well, look at what is an API before we're going to use it inside of Make, because the HTTP module is allowing us to use APIs and to call APIs and use their information. So let's look at what this means. So an API stands for Application Programming Interface. And what it allows us is to communicate between different software or between different servers. So you have one software or server or website, and you want to get the data from there to use it on another server. And in order to achieve that, you need to use this thing called an API. So let's look at this little example here. So we have the user, for example, in a restaurant, and he makes a request via the API. So the server, in this case, not the computer server, but the person working as a server in the service industry, he is going to the user and taking the request to then send it over to the kitchen. And the kitchen then prepares everything. So the API is sending that request to the kitchen saying, hey, user wanted wine and spaghetti or whatever. And then once the kitchen is ready, it's sending over the response to the API, which can be the pizza, which can be the pasta, the wine, and so forth. And the API or the server is then sending that response over to the user, giving the user all of the relevant things, such as wine, pasta, pizza, and so forth. So what are key components of an API or of APIs? Well, there are the endpoints, and the endpoints is the URLs for specific data or actions. So an endpoint is just the link that you enter into your URL tab, for example, right? So let me show you. This here has the endpoint edit, okay? Or this entire URL with the endpoint edit. And this is the action where it says, well, I can edit this presentation, for example. Then there are the different request types. So you can either get information, you can post information, meaning you can send new information to a server that would probably then store the information in a database. And with get, you would get the information from the database. Then you can also put information in the database. This is the keyword that will update an entry in a database. And finally, you can delete items from a database. So from a server that has a database. And then there are these things called headers, and there you can send metadata, like for example, authentication tokens. So a database usually is secured, so you cannot just access it without being authenticated, so allowed to access the data. For example, if you log in to your social media accounts, you don't want anyone else to have access to your social media account, so you need to log in, and then you are authenticated. And once you are authenticated once, you don't need to authenticate again, because usually you get something called a token, and this token then is stored on your device, for example. And then when you open up the server again and you request data from the server or the application again, such as, let's say, Facebook or Instagram or whatever, it just knows, oh, you are that user and you are signed in or authenticated. If you go to a separate device and start the application again, you are not going to be authenticated. You would need to authenticate with that phone again in order to then get access to your account, okay? And the responses that you get from an API, they are often in JSON format. It says often, it's not always. There are different types of formats available as well, but JSON is just the format that is agreed upon that most servers are using or most APIs are using, because it's very efficient, it's easy to read, and it's also easy to read for computers, not just for humans. So if we look at that, we have the client, for example, our computer or our phone. It sends an HTTP request, which is either get, post, delete, or put with a URL. So here, for example, whatever the URL of the API is, that goes then to the server. The server then understands what needs to be done. For example, get some information about, let's say, Dennis. So get the information, name, age, skills, address, get all of this information from the server. The server then responds with a JSON file that has all of this information and sends it over to the client. So the client then can read this information and visually prepare it so that it looks a little nicer. So coming back to the example with, let's say, your Instagram account, there you log in and you want to have details about your feed. So it sends a request to the server, give me feed. So then the server responds with the feed. So all of the URLs that are relevant for your feed, all the videos, all the images, how many likes are on the video, how many comments are on the video, and so forth. All this information is sent over to your phone, and your phone then also requests the data. Very often the data, like the video itself and so forth, is stored on a separate server, and then it downloads the image or the video and displays it on your phone. Okay, and does it in a nice manner. So not just in an ugly JSON file. So now let's go ahead and actually use an API here. So I'm going to unlink this webhook. I'm going to connect the webhook to this tutorial API. And the one that I'm using here is spoonacular.com. Okay, so you can go over to this website. It's called spoonacular.com/food-api/docs #authentication. So this is where you can read about authentication. But then let's say you want to search recipes, and you would use the GET request like we saw earlier. Okay, so this is where you get the GET request. If you want to, let's say, get a random recipe, so this would be that. You would use this endpoint, so this URL with the GET request as well. And the response headers are going to be, well, you're going to get data in JSON. So that's what kind of information you're going to get. And you're going to get a few parameters. So how about we just try that? So we use this URL, we copy it, and then we go over to our own automation here. So that was the one that we used for JSON. So I'm going to delete all the modules that we had here, and I'm just going to use an HTTP module, make a request. Here I'm going to add the URL. Okay, so this is this URL that I got from here. And I'm going to say the method is get. I get that from here. So it says get. Then I need to pass headers. So I need to pass a header. Therefore, you need to be signed in. So once you are signed in, you get access to something called an API key. An API key is unique to your account, and so that they know that you are the one who is requesting this information. And this also authenticates you, so to speak, right? So once you are signed in, you will find that you get an API key. Okay, so coming back to our HTTP module, you need to add headers here, and you need to give it the name as well as here the API key that you got from your own account. So in order to get that key, once you are logged in, you go to your profile and API key, and then you click on show hide API key, and then you can copy that key. Or you can click on generate new API key in case you want to use a separate or a new API key for your new solution. Okay, so then you can paste that value in here. Now, important is going to be what you enter as the name for the header. Okay, so let me go back to the docs, and we need to go to authentication here. Therefore, we can search for authentication, and you have the authentication guide, where it says you need to send the API key with your API key. So you can access this with this URL. So let me just show you what I mean by this. Okay, so we saw earlier, if you want to get a random recipe, what we can do is we can copy this thing here, and then going back to the authentication here, we needed to add this to our URL. So I'm just going to add this to the URL equals, and then the API key that I have. All right. So I'm going to use that API key in here after the equal sign, press enter. And this is the output that I'm getting. So you see, I get the output and in JSON format. It's pretty overwhelming, but if you click on this pretty print, you see it looks a lot more enticing or readable. Okay. So it generated this a lot more readable JSON document or JSON text that I can now read. So it created a recipe, or it created recipes. You see here, squared brackets. What does it mean? It's an array. We know that, right? We saw how arrays work. So whenever we have a squared bracket, that's an array inside of JSON. So one of the items that we get is this one here. So it creates this recipe, and there are a lot of details about this recipe. For example, that it is a vegetarian recipe. It's not vegan, so vegan is set to false. It's gluten-free. It's not dairy-free, it's not very healthy, it's not very cheap, it's not very popular, and so forth, right? And then you get some details about the ingredients that are in there. Then, well, all of the ingredients and so forth. Okay, so this is the response that you get. Now you could go ahead and use this response in order to build this out in a beautiful interface and make it look nice and create a very beautiful recipe user interface. I even created a course on that particular example for my Android masterclass, where we teach that in depth. But this is not about coding. This is about how you can use it in here. So how can we now make sure that this header has the right information? Well, therefore, we can go back to our authentication here. And you can see here where it says, alternatively, you can put the API key in the request header as X API key or X minus API minus key. So let's do that. Let's add that to our headers. You can see that headers word again with the name X API key and the value, which is the API key that we have gotten from our own console here under profile API key. Okay, so the body type there, we can say it's raw, and then we can say it's JSON application JSON, because the response that we're getting is of that particular type. So it is a JSON response. This here is a JSON response that we get. So you select the content type JSON, the body type raw, and then you can click on OK. At this point, we can run our automation. Now, you wouldn't even need the webhook here, actually. We can even say that we deactivate this unlink and we drag this in here. So if we do that, then this automation will be triggered immediately as data arrives, for example. Well, that wouldn't work. Now that let me delete this module. We could say every 15 minutes, for example, or every 1 minute or whatever. So, however, I'm going to do it with my webhook. I'm going to use one of my webhooks from earlier, the webhook tutorial one. I'm going to copy this address and I'm going to connect it to here, and this will send back the trigger to the webhook. So now I'm going to run this once, and I'm going to use the webhook that I just got from here, the URL. Okay, so you use the URL from your webhook, you go over here, you enter your URL. This time you don't need to add any information. I just use the webhook to trigger the automation. Okay, I don't pass any information from this webhook. And once I did that, my automation is being run and my API call is happening. So we did make our first HTTP request and we used an API for that. And now this was our input. You see a lot of data that we never even touched, but it automatically happens through the HTTP make request. And the URL, that's what we have as the interesting part. We use this random recipes URL. And then as the output, we get this bundle 1 with a status code of 200. We're going to go deeper into status codes in video 6 of this series. And 200 just means success. You got the data. Then we see the headers. Well, I'm not going to go into those. I'm interested in the data. And the data is the actual output. So this is the output that we got. Now we can copy all of that. And we go back to our friend here from JSON Formatter and we just paste all of that in here and we process it. And then we're going to get this a lot more readable JSON text. So you can see that we have gotten recipes and in particular one recipe. So you see this is just one object. We get one recipe and here we get all of the properties of the recipe, and some of the properties are of type array, for example, extended ingredients. And here we have all of the ingredients. So ingredients 1, ingredients 2, ingredients 3. So for example, cheese is an ingredient for that. Then, well, it says goat cheese here. There's even an image that it gives us. Then the salt, well, we need salt. We need cranberry sauce. And yeah, that's it. So these are the ingredients. Then we have some additional details like dish type, diets, instructions, and so forth. Okay. So that was an example of how we can use the HTTP module and use an API and specifically make an API request to an API that we got access to. So this is a free API, at least for some things. So for the random page, for example, but then if you wanted to build a fully designed and more complex, let's say cooking application that you're offering to users out there through an application or a website or whatever, then you would have to take one of the paid tiers usually, because in the free tier, you just get 150 points per day, which is good enough for what we want to do, but we can only make one request per second. Otherwise, we would have to wait. So let's say you have 100 users and 2 of them are trying to make a request at the same time. One of them would have to wait for a second for the response to happen if they are using the free tier, or if you are using the free tier. Okay, so that's the thing with APIs. There are APIs out there that are entirely free. Then there are APIs that have a free tier, but then there are also APIs that are always expensive or that are always paid, so that you always need to pay money for. Okay, so let's get started with the HTTP module. So whenever we have a webhook and it triggers an automation, I want this time to just make a request. Okay, so here when you select HTTP module, you can just do like that and you can select it here, then you can make a request. So in this video, we're just going to make a request. In the next one, we're going to make an authenticated request, and you're going to learn what that means and how that works. But let's start with that. So we make a request. Now you need this HTTP module whenever you want to use an API that is not directly available in here. So you see there are many tools in here. There's Apify, there's Slack, Pinterest, and so forth. All of these tools have an API, and make.com built this module based on their API. But sometimes not all the features that the API of any of those given websites or tools, not all the features that are available are actually available inside of the make module itself. So for example, if you go to LinkedIn, you will find that there are a few things that you can do directly from here, but then there are things that you cannot select directly from the LinkedIn module, and therefore you would have to use the LinkedIn API, and you could get the data from there. And you could make a significantly more advanced call and get more advanced data or more data than is available through this module. So that's why this HTTP module is not only relevant for modules which aren't available inside of Make, but also for the ones that are available, but the API of those services or websites has more to offer that Make hasn't integrated, because it is a lot of work to build all of these things out, and they need developers to do all of that stuff. So in that case, they maybe just do the, let's say, 20% that are most used, and all the other stuff that you can still do, that's something you would have to do yourself with such an HTTP request. Okay, but we're not going to do it with any of those complex APIs. We're just going to do it with this very simple one, and spoonacular.com, and there you can just go over to the docs and you can check out the API documentation. So the documentation contains information about how to use an API. So any given API for any kind of website, some are available for recipes like this one, others are available for weather, others are available for sports betting, and so forth. All of those APIs, they have a documentation which explains you how things work and what endpoints they have. So an endpoint for this particular case here is to search recipes. So last time in video 3, we just got a random recipe. So we used this endpoint, and by endpoint, I just mean this URL. But today we're going to actually search for recipes, and therefore you're going to learn how parameters work. So let's go ahead and use this code here, or this URL, and use it in our HTTP module. So we need an URL or a URL here at the top inside of our HTTP module. Then we need to select the method, and I'm going to say I want to get data. So I want to get information from that API. And then I need to add a header, because I need to use the API key in order to register myself as being the one who has access to this API, because this is not fully for free unless you are fine with the free tier. But if you want to use it in a real world application where you have a bunch of users, then you would have to select one of those paid tiers. So in order for them to know who is making the calls, they create this thing called an API key. And we are using that API key in order to identify ourselves as the user who makes the call. Okay, who wants to retrieve the data from that website. So what we're going to do now is we can register here. We can go to the console. We can get the API key. So you can show the API key or generate a new API key. I already have one here, so I'm just going to use that. And I'm going to add that as the value. And the name for that API key, that's something that you need to get from authentication. So you just need to search for authentication, and there you will find the authentication guide. And it says, if you want to have an API key request, you need to add that to your header. So that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm adding this as the x-API-key name with the value of the API key, and the body type will be raw and the content type will be JSON. So we looked at that in the last video in case you're wondering. So at this point, if I use the complex search, I can add something called a query string. So I can add parameters to the query string. A query is a search request, so to speak. So I'm searching for a given name, a given value. And if you go over here and you go to search recipes, you see you can search recipes by query. So if you use the parameter query, you could, for example, search for pasta. So this is the natural language recipe search query. So let's just do exactly that. Let's use query as type string with example pasta. So therefore, I'm going to go here. I'm going to say, actually, I'm going to copy it because then I cannot make any mistakes. So I'm going to take this query, and as a value, I'm just going to say pasta, for example. Okay. And now let's just go ahead and test this. So I'm going to take this webhook that I created. I'm going to copy this mail address, run the automation, wait for new data, go into new tab, enter the URL and press enter. I see that it says accepted. My automation ran through. I can see this one here. I can click on it and I can see the output. So I'm not so much interested in the input. I'm more interested in the output. And this is the data that I get. So I get a response of type JSON. We looked into what JSON means and what it does. So if you want to make this more readable, you can go to any of your favorite JSON formatters, for example, jasonformatter.curiousconcepts.com. You could process it and then it will show you what the results are. So it gave me a bunch of recipes that have pasta in it. So this one, for example, here, you see farfalle with peas and ham and cream. Then we have what to make tonight, bruschetta style pork and pasta, linguine e americana. Then we have beef lo mein noodles, whatever. So all of these, they have pasta in them. So these are the results that I got, a bunch of results, actually 10 of them, and 10 recipes that I could now go ahead and use. Pistachio pasta sounds very nice, even though I'm intolerant against pistachio. So there we are. We made a request with a query. So now that we did that with pasta, let's try something else. Let's say we want to have 10 beef recipes. So I'm going to change that to beef. I'm going to run it again. I'm going to wait for new data. I'm going to run the webhook again. Just press enter. And then I should get a bunch of beef responses here. So a bunch of recipes that contain beef. So I'm going to copy that again. I'm going to make it readable. So post it in here. And now I have pork schnitzel and apple salad. Then I have beef pot pies with Irish cheddar crust, braised anise beef, and so forth. You see all kind of beef recipes. So here their beef is made in meatballs and so forth. So now that we know how queries work, let's try a final one. Let's try cuisine, okay? Or maybe even, well, if you want to have a certain diet. So let's say, let's do diet, okay? Let's say we are a vegetarian, so we should not get any meat recipes. So let's modify our HTTP module where we say that the diet is going to be vegetarian. No, actually, I'm not going to write that out. I'm going to copy it from here. So there we are, vegetarian. Yeah, I would have mistyped it. And if you mistype it, it will not work properly. So if you have a typo in there or something like that. So let's save it like this. Let's run it once more. Let's wait for new data. Let's go ahead and run it. And we will see that the result that we get is going to be some vegetarian stuff. So none of the food that we're going to get, or the recipes that we're going to get now, should contain any meat. So asparagus and pea soup, that sounds pretty vegetarian. Garlic kale, garlicky kale. Yeah, some of them are a little weird. Let's actually check out one of these things here. Red kidney bean jambalaya. That sounds nice. Let's do that. There we are. So this is a vegetarian meal. You even get the image associated with it. Cauliflower brown rice, vegetable fried rice. Well, some people will love that. Others will not so much. So let's go over here. There we are. Okay. So these are just some example outputs that we get. Now let's look at one option that we have at the very bottom and what it does. And that's this parse response. So we can set that to true, and then it will allow us to parse the response into usable objects. So there are two different ways how you can do that. Either you just directly use this thing called parse JSON. So this parse JSON, it will take the data output from my HTTP module now, and it will make readable data from it. Now we could create a data structure, but let's do it without, and let's just say the final is to set a variable because it just doesn't like it if if the parse JSON is the last item inside of your scenario. So let's run it once again, wait for new data. Let's run the webhook to trigger the automation, and we will see that now it took this very difficult to read JSON code or text, and it made usable objects out of it. So here it gave us the results as an array. So first is asparagus pea soup, then we have the garlicky kale, then we have the red kidney bean jambalaya, and so forth. Okay, so now what we could do is we could use any of those recipes and like store them in our database individually, for example. Okay. All right, and now because very often you have the situation where you actually want your JSON to be parsed, and this would be the default approach. Well, they decided to put this option in here to parse the response. So I can just say yes here, and then I can get rid of this module and save myself the time of creating an extra module, which I have to manually set up. So you see, before the output was like this, we got it as a pure JSON file or JSON text and unedited. And now let's run it again, and we will see that this time we get the output in the same way that we got the output from our JSON parser. Okay, so this little option that we had there in this HTTP module generated all of these outputs. And now you could go ahead and use these outputs in whatever fashion you want. You can aggregate them, you can run an automation that goes through all of them individually and stores them individually in a database, or triggers some other automation in the backend. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's what the HTTP module does. It's very powerful. And in the next video, we're going to look at how we can do the authentication, where we make sure that we get access to APIs, where you cannot just use an API key, but you actually need to be authenticated in a more sophisticated way, so to speak. Okay, because this isn't really safe, because if anybody just got my API key, they could just register as myself and use up all of my tokens or all of my credits, and generate a lot of cost for me. But there are more sophisticated ways to be authenticated. You see that there are multiple different actions available. You can get a file, you can make a basic auth request, you can make a request, but then there is also this make an OAuth 2.0 request. And I'm going to show you how that works. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to select this make an OAuth 2 request. So I have this webhook, I'm going to click plus, then I select the HTTP module here and specifically make an OAuth 2.0 request. So when you have that, you see that you can select different actions there up here. If you don't have any actions available there, you will need to click on this add button. And then you can click the authorize URI, token URI, client ID, and client secret in order to authenticate yourself for API services that have a authentication server associated with them. So let's look at what all of these things mean before we go deeper into the practice part. So I prepared a little presentation here. So let's look at what OAuth 2 is. OAuth 2 is a secure API access protocol or framework. So this framework allows third-party applications to access resources on behalf of a user without sharing their credentials, so without sharing their login information. So some key components that we need to look at are the client ID and the secret, which are unique identifiers for the app requesting access. So let's say our make.com app, our scenario, is trying to access an API. We need to have a client ID and a secret, which are specific to our make.com application. Then there is this thing called access token, which is a temporary key to access resources. So when you are logged into the server, you get the access token, and this token is just a very, very long string or a bunch of characters, so to speak. And those are this token has all the details about you having access to a certain piece of a server. So this is specifically important and relevant when you have a user account, you are logged in, and inside of your user account, you have all of the different data stored about you. Or let's say if you want to access some social media tools or whatever, you cannot just do that with an API key. You actually need to be authenticated. Once you authenticate yourself, you get a token. So this access token, which is stored inside of your cookies. And yeah, basically then whenever you access this website, you will see that you are logged in automatically, for example. And the same thing technically happens here. So whenever you are cleaning your cookies, deleting all your cookies in the browser, and you try to access a website, you see that you will need to log in again because the access token is not stored in your cookies anymore, and you need to log in again in order to issue a new access token. So then there is this thing called an authorization server, which verifies user identity and issues the token. So this authorization server is often, well, it's mainly separated from the resource server. So it's not the same computer, so to speak, somewhere. It's not the same server. It's two different servers. One is taking care of only the authentication or authorization, and the other one has all the details, such as all of your personal details that you have in a database, for example, or any other relevant information that are stored inside of an API server, or that the API offers you, so to speak. And then we have the resource server, and that is the system where protected data or services reside. Okay, so this is only relevant for data that is protected. If we look at the example that we built in the last video where we used Spoonacular, all of this information is not protect-worthy or protection-worthy. Okay, so whether a meal that is a pasta meal or whatever, it's not really protection-worthy. But if it's something that has to do, let's say, with your health information or like your health insurance or insurance information or whatever, all of that information should not be easily accessible through an API key. It should be something that you need to be authenticated in order to get the information. Okay, so that's how it looks like. You are the client, in our case, our Make application, and it accesses the authorization server and tries to authenticate. Okay, so it tries to say, hey, I am the application that has the access rights to certain information. And then the authorization server goes to the application. And finally, the application then gets access to the resource server and loads all of the relevant information to display in the application. And in our API specific case, the application will then send data back to our client, so to our Make application, where we can then use the information in our automation. Okay, so coming back here, let's set up a connection using the authorization URI and token URI. Therefore, I have selected this particular example here, which is deviantart.com. You can see that here, deviantart.com/developers. There you find the details. And it explains here that there are 3 ways for applications and websites to integrate with DeviantArt. So I'm just using this example because it's just available and we can use it for testing, which is great. So there are 3 different APIs. So OEmbed MPI, RSS API, and then the DeviantArt-API. So here you see getting started with OAuth 2.0. That's the keyword that we were talking about earlier. So to use our OAuth API, first you need to have a DeviantArt account, and then you need to log in to register a new developer application. And once that is done, you will be given a client ID and secret ID. And if you look back here, you see here, we need a client ID and a secret ID. Okay, so let's set those things up. Therefore, we need to register an application and we need to log in. So once you are logged in, you can register an application. All right, once you're here, you need to register your application. So I'm going to call this one AI Dennis Tutorial, HTTP or something like that. You can add a description, you can leave it out. Then you have 2 options for the OAuth 2 grant type. The implicit one, which would hold the token somehow in the communication. So the more secure way is the authorization code option. Then you need to whitelist some websites. So for example, in my case, I want to use make.com to, well, with this particular API. So I need to whitelist Integromat. So there is this thing, if you just Google for it, you will find that, well, you just need to Google for integromat OAuth 2 URL, and you will find this URL here. So this is the URL that you need to copy, and you need to put it inside of your DeviantArt whitelisting down here. And the original URL whitelist, that's where you also need to add integromat. Okay, so here add URL whitelist, this integromat.com URL. Whitelisting basically just means that you are allowing API calls that come from this website. So in our particular case, we are using make.com. So this is our application, right? We're trying to access with our application, we're trying to access this API. And in order to make it securer so that this API call cannot come from any other website or any other person, but only come from make.com calls, that's why we are whitelisting it. The opposite of whitelisting is blacklisting. So blacklisting just makes sure that, for example, somebody where an API call coming from a certain server would not be accepted at all. So it would be declined instantly. And whitelisting is just the other way around, where you just say no other websites can access the API call or no other services except for this particular one. We're adding it to our whitelist. And then if you scroll further down, we're going to disable comments, because otherwise you would get notifications whenever there is a new entry inside of your application. So somebody makes a comment to your application or whatever, then you would get notified. So let's just disable it from the start so that we don't get bothered. All right. So as I said, again, we're using DeviantArt because it's just an easy and cheap way to get to know OAuth 2. You don't have to use this one. You can use it with other tools as well, but this is just going to be easier to follow along. Okay, so then we can save our application. All right, now that we have that, going back to the developers page, when we are logged in, we will see our application. So our published application here, this AI Dentist Tutorial HTTP, then we have the client ID. I can take that, I can go back to make, I can put that in here as the client ID, and then I can copy this secret here, and I can also go over to make and add it as the client secret. So what I'm missing now is the authorized URI and the token URI. So where do I get those from? Therefore, you can go over to the authentication part on the website. So here you go to authentication, and there you will find, well, the whole explanation as to what that does and how it works. So here we have the user authorization and the getting a user access token. So I'm going to copy this authorization. This is the authorized URI. So URI is like the URL. And then we need to do the same thing with the token. So we paste that in here. And at that point, we should be ready to go. Once we click OK, we need to authorize make.com inside of our DeviantArt tool. Okay. And once we did that, we should have a connection. So there we are. Now I have this my HTTP to OAuth connection. I didn't give it a proper name. You can go over to your connections here and rename it accordingly. But now we can go and set up the URL to actually do an HTTP request to the API that we want to use, in this case to DeviantArt. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the URL that we want to use. So you see here DeviantArt and stash. There you can select different types of endpoints. So here daily deviations, deviations you watch, home, and so forth. All right. So let's say I want to browse daily deviations. This is going to be the URL. So the endpoint that I want to use. So it's a get response or get request. So here the method is set to get. This is the URL that I just looked at. So this will now give me the daily deviations. All right. So at this point we can try it out, but we should run into a problem. And that is something that is specific to DeviantArt, but let's just run it with our webhook that we had earlier. And well, we get data, but it says insufficient scope. So we get a response, so to speak, no error in make.com. But we get a status code 403, well, which is just an error code, okay? And we're gonna jump into error or status codes in the next video, but before we do that, let's actually fix this problem. Therefore, I'm gonna go over to connections and I'm going to modify this particular connection that I just made. But before I do that, let's actually make sure that we save this. So this is HTTP OAuth tutorial Okay, let's save it so that we don't lose it. Then go over to connections and select the connection that you just made. And here under connections, you will find this My OAuth connection. I'm going to edit that connection because I didn't add a scope. So we need to add a scope here. Otherwise, there is this error that we just saw and we don't get the details. So that is something that isn't really well explained in the DeviantArt from what I can tell. So here are some examples, the access token, but nothing really about the scope. So what we can do is we can just add this browse scope in here. Okay, so I'm going to say browse in here. And let me check if I wrote it correctly. Yeah, there we are. So I'm going to leave everything else as is. I'm going to save and I will need to authorize the application once again. So click on authorize. And once we're done with that, let's jump back to our scenario that we built, this HTTP OAuth tutorial. And let's run this once again. So wait for new data, run the webhook. And now this time we get some results. So we get a bunch nicer outputs. Now we can also make it, well, we can parse it so that we get a better, more relevant output or more readable output. So let's jump into that. Let's look at the data results and we see we get 12 results. So these are the arts of the day. So this is, for example, 1. So I can go to this URL and this is the year of trees. This is one of the DeviantArt items that was created for us. Or here, the next output is sunflower, I guess. So let's go over here. There we are. So it's not really about the application itself. It's really just about this authentication. And that was the goal of this video. And I believe we achieved that. We saw how we can set up this authentication. By the way, about this little connection change that I made. And let's go back. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to this connection change. So now how would you know about this scope that you need to set it to browse? How would you know about that when you are setting up your OAuth connection? Well, that's the thing. You would have that either in the documentation, specifically explaining you how that works, or you would just try it without this scope. You would get an error. You would search for the error, like you use ChatGPT, for example, to tell you how you can fix that error. And then you just follow the instructions and you should find a solution. But that is a specific situation that you have for the DeviantArt authentication. In other like OAuth 2 authentications, you wouldn't need the scope necessarily. Okay, so this really highly depends on the connection that you want to make or the OAuth connection that you want to use. Okay, the API. So some APIs have that, some don't need that. So that's something that you need to be aware of. In case you wondered where I got this browse from, well, you can see that here where it says scope browse. Okay, so this is the error. Well, I went back to the history of our iterations and I went to the details here, and then I can see the output that I've gotten. And the output from this make.com request here, this OAuth 2 request, was that it says insufficient scope, and I needed to set the scope to browse. And that's how I did it. Okay, just so you were aware. All right, so we use this HTTP module in multiple different ways. We're going to look at what the response codes mean and which ones there are. So we use this HTTP module, and the response code that we've gotten was 200 the last time that we ran it. But the time that we ran it before that, we got a 403. So what does this mean? What do these status codes mean? In order to understand that, let's look at a quick presentation here. So status codes are indications of the result of an API request. So they matter because they help you in debugging and understanding API interactions. So there are different categories of response codes, and the response codes are this status code that you get as output when you are making an HTTP request. Okay, and they can have, well, certain numbers, right? So they start either with a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So if they start with a 1, then they're just informational status codes. If they start with a 2, then they are success status codes. For example, the status code 200 means okay. The status code 201 means created. All right. So then there are 300 status codes. So these are redirection status codes. So they redirect you from the URL that you thought you wanted to access to another URL where the thing now resides, whatever it is, maybe a certain file or a certain website or whatever. Then you have the error codes, which are client error codes and server error codes. So client error codes start with a 4 and server error codes start with a 5. The most common client error codes are 400, which is a bad request. So you're trying to access something that doesn't exist. 401 is you're trying to access you're not authorized for. 404 means this item that you're trying to access just isn't there. So it just doesn't exist. So what's the difference between a bad request and not found? The bad request response code just means that there is something wrong in your request. For example, the wrong parameter or the parameter doesn't exist or something like that. And the 404 not found plainly means that the endpoint that you tried to access doesn't exist. So the URL that you're trying to access doesn't exist. But then there are the server errors. So for example, the 500, which is an internal server error, or 503, the service is unavailable. So this just means that maybe the server is down and you're trying to access a server that doesn't exist, or something is wrong with the server. Okay, so these are the different response codes, and the most common ones that you will come across is going to be 200, which is okay, which means it was a successful request. So you tried to access an API and it worked. You got the data back. Perfect. That's what we had here, right? We got the status code 200, which is the response code 200, which means perfect or okay. Then 400, which is a bad request. So something is wrong with your request. Then we have 401, which is unauthorized. So that happens when the authentication was required, but you didn't enter it accordingly, or it was just invalid. So the token that you tried to access the API with didn't work, or the API key didn't work, or you're just not signed in, so to speak. And then the 501, which is the internal server error. So there's something wrong with the server and it just doesn't respond accordingly. So these are possible response codes, or some examples of possible response codes. There is a full list of a bunch of them. If you want to learn more about the response codes in depth, you can check out the Wikipedia article here. You see there are a bunch of different response code options here. 300 use proxy, unauthorized, payment required, forbidden, not found, and so forth. So you see there are a lot more than the ones that I just showed you, but many of them you will never come across unless you are a developer that works for many, many years. Most of them will not be something you come across. Okay. All right. That's it for this video. By the way, if you haven't joined my AI automation specialist yet, where you're going to learn a lot more about AI automation, about make.com and how to use Airtable most efficiently to build amazing automations, then you should definitely join now. You should definitely check it out. There are a bunch of really amazing templates as well here that are business focused and that you can sell to businesses and make you a decent living out of it, or start your own business even. So that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this series, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and comment as well as subscribe. I would really love to hear your opinion, and please let me know what you want to learn next. So with that, thank you very much and have a nice day.